Hey, good morning, GBC family. We're filming this on Monday morning, and my name is Zach, and we are talking about what I learned on Sunday. What we've learned throughout the course of the He Gets a series is that as sitting in our teaching team meetings and sitting in a group, is we've all wanted to talk about Jesus, and we've all wanted to talk about what he has meant to our lives and how he's affected us, and this has brought out great conversation. And we've kind of realized that there's just not enough time on a Sunday morning for 30 minutes to talk about all of these topics and all the texts that go to it. So an idea that kind of birthed out of that is that we're going to sit down every Monday morning with a couple of us who are on the teaching team and just talk the topic, which in this particular case was loneliness, and we're going to talk the text. So today I brought in a good friend of mine, Hayden Davison. Say hi to the camera, Hayden.
Hi to the camera, Hayden.
Hayden is our children's pastor, and he works with our kids. And so we thought, why not grab a youth teacher and a children's teacher, and we'll talk about what I heard on Sunday and kind of how we're talking about it in our respective ministries. So we're going to go from there. If you were with us on Sunday, we were talking loneliness and what the Bible says about loneliness, and we took two specific passages. We talked about Jesus specifically and how he experienced loneliness, and then we talked about how he stepped into another woman's loneliness at the time. So we're going to just take those two texts, and we're going to dive right in, and we're going to talk about the loneliness that Jesus experienced first. So Hayden's going to tackle that one. So
just the easy one.
I gave him the easy one.
It's not a controversial passage at all. So we find in Matthew 27, like Troy talked about, the Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, the my God, why have you forsaken me? And after talking about this and trying to figure out how I was going to approach this with the kids, I fell down this like rabbit hole of the different perspectives and things like that. And what I learned was there's two broad perspectives, and that one is that there was a separation in the Trinity, and God did turn his back on Christ, and there is another school of thought that says, no, this is just what Jesus was feeling, which is the viewpoint that Troy expressed on Sunday. And what I learned for me is that I have opinions on this, but to make a bold theological statement that I know for a fact that one of those is true feels like I would be claiming to have an understanding of the Trinity beyond what I do. And so I think what I had to step back and learn in this as I was just rabbit holing is I had to acknowledge the limitations of human consciousness and understanding an infinite being that is God and the way that he exists. But that was the deep theological end where I had to pull myself back and from the brink and go, I'm focusing too much on things that are interesting but are not poignant to or overly important to my salvation, right? The truth of the matter is that Jesus died, rose from the dead, ascended to heaven, and as a result, I get to spend eternity in paradise with him. But there is this interesting piece that probably for the first time, Jesus feels lonely in communion with the other parts of the Trinity. And specifically, he mentions the Father. And how severe and how extreme and how strange that must have felt. And for somebody to have lived and existed in a perfect unity and perfect communion forever, to now experience loneliness for whatever reason in that space, to think about the depth of loneliness that must have been, and to still go through with it and to still sacrifice himself because of his love for creation, is really impactful to me. Even outside of just the I see that God knows what it is to be lonely, which is important and influential and impactful on me because, I told the kids, because I teach the elementary age on Sundays. So does Zach's wife. She flips with me. At their age, I was in, I think it was, but between kindergarten and fourth grade, I was in 5 different schools in 3 different cities. And so loneliness is something at a young age I became very attuned to, something I have a lot of experience with. And so to know that Jesus is not only with me in it, but can not commiserate, but understand what I'm feeling. It's crazy.
I talk about it from like my own personal story. If you've been around me the last year, I talked about how I left the inland Northwest. We actually talked about that on Wednesday in the community update, and how I had traveled 1,600 miles to take a job in ministry. And the first year we weren't here, but it did not go like I thought it would. And I remember thinking, like, I felt called into this. I left a job of 20 years. My wife and my kids were in this with me. Like, so I had somebody walking through this with me. And so I was with my wife in this loneliness, but I still felt like separation from God. I remember crying out, like, where are you in this? This is not what I signed up for. This is not exactly what I had planned. And so, and I remember feeling like shame behind that, because I'm like, here I am, a pastor, following Jesus for 30 years. I teach students to place their trust completely in God. But I remember asking myself, like, where are you in this? And, as it played out behind the scenes, he's working all of it for my benefit. But I that was the moment in my life I think I felt like deeply the most alone. And so I went back to this passage, and then I went back to the Psalms 22 passage where he took it from, where I'm like, thank you, Jesus. I know that you know what this felt like. So it was nice to have like that understanding that God went through this the same time I did. And it was just a very difficult situation. So to know that Jesus gets us in our loneliness, it just was a very meaningful passage for me. Is there anything else you want to add that you kind of went through with the kids?
Mostly with the kids, I just wanted them to I didn't dive into the theological rabbit hole that I went down, because it was, it's too much for an adult, let alone a first grader. But I just wanted them to realize, and throughout the whole thing, so in 2018, plug for the Israel trip, my wife and I went to Israel. And so as a part of this, I have been trying to find, as best I can for the stories that we have, pictures from that my wife and I took on the trip. So I showed them pictures of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Thank you. To help them see that these are real places and tangible things and real experiences that Jesus had. And so that was where I really emphasized for them with the Matthew 27 passage, that Jesus, here's the real place, right? With some certainty. And Jesus is really there, and he really said these things, and he really felt these things. And he knows what it is to be lonely. And we talked about Judas and Peter as well, loneliness with betrayal and denial, and things like that too. And so being betrayed by his friends and loneliness with God, he knows what it is to be lonely. And so I didn't dive into the huge rabbit hole of madness, but that's what we really tried to focus on. And then, a lot of when I teach the kids, I try to ask them as many questions as I just give them information, and try to pull them in. So I asked them if, when had they been felt lonely, what should you do? And I tried to encourage them to reach out to Jesus. I did not say that Jesus would cure their loneliness. He might, but he also might not. But he does promise he will be with us in those moments, in those times of loneliness, and can provide us comfort, even if he's plan is to let us sit in it and teach us or bring us somewhere through it, versus just take it away.
Yeah, so we talked about Jesus and experiencing his loneliness and separation from the Father, and then Troy taught specifically on what it was for Jesus to step into somebody's loneliness, and then he did a good job of setting up that story with the woman with the bleeding issue and the hemorrhaging issue. And so I want to do some review on that. He used the Mark 5:25 passage, but it also tailors off of Matthew 9 as well, and so I'll talk about both of those real quickly. So he talked about the woman who was experiencing a medical condition, and he talked about how that medical condition, regardless of where the bleeding was, would have rendered her what's called ritually unclean in the Jewish world. So what it means to be ritually unclean comes from Leviticus 15, and it says that anytime that there's any issue of blood, you can't come to assembly. So you can't meet, you're ritually unclean, you have to go through the cleansing passages. Nobody could touch you. We talked about that on Sunday, like that physical touch and what she would have felt like for 12 years to have not experienced any of that. One of the things I think about specifically and what it teaches is that if she's ritually unclean, not only could she go to the temple, she couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't go to what was called a synagogue. That was their normal meeting place on their Saturday morning or their Sabbath day. And that she lived in a time where she didn't have access to like a physical Bible like we do. She would have had to have gone there, learned from the rabbi, listened to the rabbi speak the text. And so for 12 years, if she's not able to commune, it's not like we have it, right now, like we live in a spoiled world where we can like get online and talk, virtually have church anywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can be spiritually engaged or intellectually engaged, but spiritually lonely.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, where she couldn't even be intellectually engaged.
She couldn't do any of that. And so she's separated from her entire community because she's got this physical ailment. And then we think about it from our culture, like you have some sort of physical ailment. There are people that are lining up to bring you casseroles. Like there's just this thing about our culture that's different from them. They would have looked at a physical ailment as sin-related issue or a separation type issue. So she is lonely, not only from her community, but she has a hard time getting access to the God she loves and the God that she is pursuing, clearly because she's pursuing Jesus in this moment. And then Troy talked about, he actually brought out a prayer shawl, a tallit, which I have one as well. And the tallit is talked about in the book of Numbers, and that he talked about her tzitio, which is the cord that is at the end of the tallit, and then the blue cord that she reaches out for and grabs. That's actually in Matthew, the fringes. There's some early Jewish writing that talk about how the rabbi is protected when they wore these, and that the power from the rabbi or the comfort from God comes through having those on the four corners. And so when she reaches for that cloth, she's not reaching just for a specific piece of cloth. She's reaching out, hoping that there's power within that cord, there's power within that rabbi that she follows, and there's power within Jesus. And she's healed instantly upon pulling that cord. And the interesting thing is, what the thing that I love about the whole thing is that Jesus looks at her and calls her daughter. And Troy talked about that specifically on Sunday. And for me, it's like, how long has it been in her life since she's been called daughter, or she's been a daughter to somebody? And then her faith, her pursuance. She's got all this stuff that says, not only am I ritually unclean, but I'm going to go through the crowd regardless of the consequences, and I'm going to get to Jesus. So there's a little fight in her, even with her loneliness. But Jesus understands what she's going through, reaches into that, and knows exactly what she must have experienced in that moment. And that's a beautiful picture of how Jesus meets us in our loneliness. Did you talk about that at all on Sunday with your group?
We did. Again, I didn't dive into the specifics of the ailment because that felt like, what we kind of talk about the ailment being, because that felt like overstepping my place as children's pastor. And I plan on sending an email to parents today talking about that. We did touch on the passage, and if you want to take that conversation further with your children, you can. But we did. We talked about not even so deep as the prayer shawl, but just that this woman had a medical condition and was considered ritually unclean, and was ostracized, and how that would have felt. And we had kids share about how, because I asked them, have you ever felt pushed away or ostracized or cut out? And we had kids share things like, somebody who I thought was my friend, made a new friend, and now they told me they don't want to be my friend anymore. They don't want to hang out with me. I was really excited to hang out with this person at lunch, but they totally ignored me, and these things like that. So even at a young age, I think we all know what it is like to be excommunicated a little bit in some way. And so I think they really connected with her in that sense, even if we didn't dive into the nitty gritty of why entirely, besides that she was sick, and because she was sick and she had a bleeding condition, she was ritualistically unclean. Yeah, or ceremonially or ritually, it's the same.
All
right, I was in the right. I was like, wait a minute, I had a panic moment because I'm a camera. And So.
Well, that's great. I'm glad my kids are involved in that, and so this was a good opportunity for our kids and youth pastors to sit down and talk about what we learned on Sunday. So if you like this, if this is something you want to see, we're going to try to do this throughout the course of the series, because the series is resonating with not only us as teachers, but a lot of people that are in the congregation. And it's just great to know and check in with how Jesus understands us. He gets us, how he gets us in our loneliness. And each topic in each week, we're going to tackle what we learned on Sunday, and we're going to explore that. So we hope you join in and tune in with us on Monday mornings when we send these out. So I appreciate it. Thanks, Hayden, for showing up and
Thanks for the invite
and taking the hard passage. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.